But we are gonna listen you talking about zoneless testing.
Exactly.
I again hope that it will solve all my problems with testing. I have a lot of problems, you see.
I hope it doesn't generate new ones, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's give it all for Rainer. No, that wasn't.
It's all right, yeah.
So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. All right, then, yeah, welcome to my talk about zoneless testing for the next 25 minutes. I had already the introduction, so from Austria, worked in the chocolate factory and so on and so forth. And I'm also part of the Angular Architects crew, and I try to be active in the Angular community as well as often as I can. Good. When my talk was announced at NGB, then Mathieu, don't know where he is, approached me and he said, "What are you doing? You're giving a talk about experimental features, which you're not an Angular internal, so you don't even know what we want to do. Why do you do this?" And there are two reasons. First of all, when it comes to zoneless, and for those of you who don't know what zoneless is, I'm going to explain it later, but it is something which you require that you want to have when you have an application that has high performance requirements. So a lot of companies had these already, and they were saying, yes, we know it's experimental, but I need to go zoneless, and I'm just taking the risk, I'm taking the responsibility for it, and I will just give it a try. And I can tell you they are very lucky, so they don't have so many issues. But I think that's the minority. Not everyone wants to go with experimental features, but there is something else, future-proven tests. So if there is something that zoneless will change in the way how we need to write our tests, then I think it's interesting for all of us, because if I write a test today, then of course I don't want to use any things which I cannot use in the future anymore. So this talk is actually for those of us who don't really want to go into zoneless yet, but maybe want to have some kind of future-proven tests. And I can tell you there are some things that will change. So it's not like nothing changes and everything is working as it did before. Before I start with the actual test, a little bit about zoneless change detection, repetition, what it means. So as we know, in Angular, there is magic behind all of it, which has changed something of our property, which has set it to a new value, and then all of a sudden the DOM is updated. And the trigger for the complete DOM updates is Zone.js. So Zone.js is this library which says, okay, what are the options, what are the possibilities where a change in the application could happen? There are just two places. It could happen if our users interact with the application, so I click on something, I type something in, that's the case, or if an asynchronous task is executed, so an HTTP request is responded, it always comes in an asynchronous task, and when that runs, then it's also very likely that something is changing in the application. And in all these two cases, Zone.js tells Angular, might be, but it might also not be, but it might be now a good point to start with the change detection. So that's the trigger. Now what Angular is then doing, or what change detection is doing, it says, okay, let's just say there is one component that has a change. It starts to compare the state of the component, of the TypeScript class that we have, and also of the state, the way how it is in the DOM. And it's doing this for all the components. So it goes through the complete component tree. If it sees that there is a change, if it has detected a change, that's where the name is coming from, then it updates the DOM. It says, okay, now everything is synchronous, is in sync, and I can now finish and I can wait for the next change detection trigger. Now, with Zone.js, change detection stays as it is, but the trigger changes because there is no Zone.js anymore, so no one's triggering anymore. What happens instead is that if we have now a change in a component, then it is very important that this change always includes a call of mark4check. This is something we usually have most of the time, but mark4check is important because from now on, mark4check is doing the change detection trigger. So this is now replacing Zone.js and says whenever I'm called, then I also trigger immediately the change detection. As I said, it happens usually that mark4check is executed. So I have here the common places where this actually happens. We tend to say it happens in immutable property binding, but of course there needs to happen already something before property binding can start. So But yeah, mark4check is also then executed. And this, I think, is the main part. This is the main criterion which also makes it easy to use Zoneless, because whenever our users are doing some kind of DOM event, and it has to be a handled DOM event, it's also important, so we need to have an event listener. It's not enough if I just click on a button. I need to have an event listener for that button. Then mark4check is already executed. So in all these cases, when our users interact with our application, we are already safe. For those cases, and these are then the asynchronous tasks, we hope that, or we can run mark4check manually if we want. We should avoid it. We can use otherwise the async pipe that has the mark4check built in, or that's the best, that's also future-proof. Just go with signals. When a signal changes, it will also call mark4check, and then you are on the safe side. Good. So, and now about the test. I want to test now something, and I have here already a application that I usually use always. So I have here a quiz application. I hope one can see it. No. And what you can do there, you click on an answer, and well, then it shows you here correct one or incorrect. It shows you if the answer was correct or not. You can click on next question, and so on and so forth, the way how a quiz actually works. If we take a look into the code, let me maybe increase the zoom a little bit. Then we see here, when I'm talking already about experimental features, I said, okay, then I'm going all in. I'm also going to use the Rx resource. It's also experimental, but this is then the future way on how we can trigger HTTP requests. So I have here an ID coming in from the route. So that's important to remember. There is something coming from the router. And whenever the signal changes, we are kind of starting here a request via Rx resource, which will hopefully return us the complete quiz data. Okay, so far so good. Quick check at the time. Yeah. So if I want to write a test now for this, then I go into my quiz spec. So I have already prepared it. I'm using here the Angular CLI, which means I'm using Jasmine and Karma. For those of you who are using Jest, it's the same, just maybe a different set of commands, but not that much different. Good, and the way how we start, or the way how modern testing works when we have a component, then we should always try to be as close to the way how our end users are using these components, which means we really want to communicate with the component via the DOM. So we are not calling any methods, we are not asserting against properties, we are clicking on something, we are really interacting with the component. And in order to do this, coming up, we have here our testbed configuration. So what do we have here? We have here the providers, and you see already that's already the first thing. So provide experimental zoneless change detection. This is something you need to do. And once you have done this, then Zone.js is not running anymore, it's not used. And automatic change detection is also activated, which means even within the test, if I do a click or if I do something that calls mark4check, then also in the test, the change detection is also already kind of scheduled. This means I should actually run detect changes anymore. This should now already be done automatically. I also have here my HTTP client. For some reason, the imports don't work. Usually it works without any issue. So as I'm going to need to do a request, I'm also going to use the client testing from Angular, which allows me to respond without using a real HTTP request. And then I have here something very special. I'm also using here a router configuration. So I say my component is used in the context of a router. It gets the ID from the router. And if I can, I also want to include this kind of router functionality in my test. I don't want to write my own kind of router mock or something, because I don't want to make the mistake that my routing configuration or my mock works a little bit different than the original one, because then I'm testing something which will not happen in reality. So again, I try to be as close as possible to the way how it is. And then we have here the router testing harness. Not many know about this, but with the router testing harness, we can say Angular, look, you are now navigating to this URL. You call quiz with number 1. This is then also the ID. And Angular will do this for us, and we will also start to initialize the component as it is usually done also in the application. And then I have my test. I have the next things. So we have here the HTTP testing controller. I'm using that one to answer that request that goes out from my resource, and I'm going to answer it with this create quiz that you see here. So create quiz is a helper function that I've created that I don't need to create a complete quiz data, but what it does, it returns you a quiz with one question, what programming language is Angular written in, and then you have your 4 different answers. And then, and this is now very important, component fixture when stable. We are awaiting it. This means that we are telling Angular, I think that there is something you need to do in the background. There might be some asynchronous tasks running. You might also want to trigger the change detection or run it. You know it because we have enabled the automatic change detection, and we are just awaiting it. Yeah? So Angular will now also render the component, should do everything that is necessary. And then I have my actual selectors. So in this case, I'm using screen. You can also use debug element, query by CSS, but here I have helper function, which allows me to make it a little bit better. So I just need to say I want to select something which has the label question and quiz status. So basic selectors, and I need to import here the screen from that testing library, which is something, if you don't know it, I would highly recommend you to take a look at it. And then once we have those elements, we can already start to say here, okay, first of all, these imports are not working as they should. We are then saying here, within the status field, I would expect, because I didn't answer any question until now, that it says correct 0. And then I hope that somewhere this question shows up, what programming language is Angular written in. And then I say, okay, wonderful. Within the question, I want to now get something, get by row. So I'm using here also accessibility selectors. That's something that the testing library can also do for you. I say there should be a button, and then I say here name and TypeScript. And if everything is done correctly, then I say here click. And then I'm going to move the correct 0 downwards, and I say I would now expect that it's 1. And that is going to fail. Well, because there is a change detection internally, and maybe also some kind of an asynchronous task. But again, we have now one command that we can use, and that's the whenStable. That one will know if change detection is necessary. I just have to put it right before I start with my assertion. I save it as it is, and now we see the test is now working. So this is not something at the moment, not something really which I would say this is now Zoneless specific, but it works also already with Zoneless. As you see, it also works actually with Zone.js already as well. So this fixture when stable is extremely powerful, and it will become more and more powerful in the future. I also want to create a second test, so I kind of see this more here as a setup function. So I say here, okay, setup, create a new test, and what I then want to do is that I don't want to check the correct, but there is something else which is very important, the next question. It is disabled, and it only enables itself when I click on an answer, and this is something that I also want to test. So what do? I say, okay, I hope now I have the right thing. I say in this case, I'm looking for the next question button, and when I'm accessing the disabled attribute, it shouldn't be there, which means that the component, that this button is now enabled. Good. So, and now feature changes. So now I have an existing test, nothing very special, nothing very fancy. And now the way how this component should work changes a little bit. Because someone is saying, yeah, this next question, when you answer the question, maybe you don't want that your end users can immediately click on next question. There should be a little bit of a break in it, an asynchronous task, and after some time you want to enable it. So you really want to force the users to read the right answer in this case. Now I can say, okay, I go back to my quiz component, and I say, where do we have it? Here Here we are setting the button to false, the disabled status to false. And then I could say here, okay, I'm going to resolve it. And then I'm doing this in an asynchronous task. So I'm putting it into the then callback of a promise, which is by definition always asynchronous. And you see the test is still running. And the reason is, again, this whenStable protects us from possible things here, because it sees there is a promise, it waits until this promise has also ended, and that's fine. Good. But this is not this is not really what we want, because the next question is immediately enabled. We don't really see the difference. So what I could say now is that I say, no, we are not going to use the promise resolve. We are using aset timeout, and we are saying 1 second. So if I now go back, and the application reloads, you see the next question takes some time. And also, of course, the test is now failing. The whenStable will not help us here. Now, in the past, if something like this arises or came up, then what I always did is that I went into my spec and I said, yeah, there is something from Angular which is extremely powerful. I'm just going to use it, and that's the fakeAsync, because this will allow me to control time, like this. Of course, I need to use the tick and so on and so forth. And now this is the bad surprise. That I said in the beginning, things will change. There is no fakeAsync and also not a waitForAsync without in Zoneless anymore. So whenever you write a test and you're using one of these two functions, you cannot use them anymore. I mean, you can use it as long as you use Zone.js, but if you have plans to go to Zoneless, you need to say goodbye. And now the question is, okay, what's the alternative? Because something needs to be there. Yeah, here we are. So we have seen that the ComponentFixture whenStable helps us with those promises. That works. But as soon as we have a real set timeout, we are running into some issues. And there is now something new, which are the pending tasks. Pending tasks is something which is made for us from Angular. And what they are saying, and sounds a little bit strange, but they say you can tell the framework when you start an own asynchronous task, you can tell the framework once you are done with it, and we will incorporate this information, or this pending task is integrated into the whenStable. Which means I need to make some changes in my code, in my application code, not in the test. So if I go back to my component here, then I say here at the very beginning, I want to inject those pending tasks, if I actually manage to do it. Inject pending tasks, that's this new service. It's in developer preview in starting with 19. And then I can say, my dear Angular, I am about to start a new asynchronous task. So I'm adding now a new asynchronous task, and what I will do, I will notify you by using the finished that now I am done. Yeah? And Angular knows now there is a pending task somewhere in my system. It waits for it. And if I now rerun the test, I don't need to change anything else. Oh, it's not really working, although it should. But I think this is the error that I had already before. Let me quickly... Pardon? I have to... Do I still... Oh, I thought I've already... Thank you. Thank you very much. You rerun it, please. If not, I'm just going to merge the solution. But it works. Yeah, good. So as I said, these pending tasks, they are integrated into whenStable. Now whenStable says I also need to wait until those pending tasks have also finished. Now, there are some things that we need to consider when we use pending tasks. First of all, it's the official solution. So you can read it up in the documentation. Also, Rx Resource is using it under the hood. It's actually also required for server-side rendering. There's the same problem. Server-side rendering, the server also needs to know when the asynchronous task has actually ended, so that it knows the application is now finished and I can send it to the client. And as we have seen, it really empowers this whenStable. So I have one command that I can use to control all the asynchronous tasks. That's really nice. There are some downsides. In my opinion, it's not really the best developer experience. So if in my application code, I always have to add this kind of information that an asynchronous task is there, I would see this as an overhead. So I hope that maybe they can find a better way. Let's see. Timeouts are real. If I have a timeout of 1 second, this means that the test also takes more than 1 second because the tests wait for it. I don't have such a thing like tick 1000 where I can immediately move forward in time. That does not exist, which means set timeout 10 is not a good idea. 10 seconds, not 10 milliseconds. And last but not least, we are also using third-party libraries, which are also doing asynchronous tasks. And I don't know what they are doing. If someone forgets to add the pending tasks there, then I have the same problem. Good. What alternatives do we have? Well, we could kind of create stubs fakes. So I would say if this is just a one-timer that I have in my application, only one place where I use the set timeout, then I could say, okay, I write a wrapper around the window set timeout, and in my test, I just stop it. Then I say, okay, in the test, I just run it immediately. I don't wait. Or you can also create a minimal fake example, although therefore I would be a little bit careful. Don't overdo these things because there are already things that do exist. And this is what I mean by testing framework. So Jasmine and Jest both have options where you can fake the timers that is there. And in our case, and I'm not going to write it, but what you could do, that I could remove the complete pending tasks from my code. And in my test, I'm going to use Jasmine clock. In Jest, it would be use fake timers. They will override Windows set timeout, Windows set interval, and all that stuff, not the promises though. And I'm installing it, and then again we have here this tick where I can say I want to now move forward for 1 second, but I don't want to wait for 1 second. I just want to run all the asynchronous tasks which are scheduled within this time period. That works, but, and I mentioned this before, these existing native frameworks, they have issues with promises, especially when promises and timeouts coming together. When you have a promise and inside of the promise you're scheduling a Windows and timeout, then it's possible to fix it, but it's not very developer friendly. So what Angular currently is doing, that they have reached out to the testing frameworks, Jasmine and Jest, so that they introduce something which just provides a good developer experience. And I have here the 2 PRs, both are coming from Andrew Scott, who's saying we need to have one function where I can say you go forward for 1 second, and regardless if it's a promise or if it's a timeout or whatever, you just run those asynchronous tasks. So this is still, as it says here, under construction, but this is the path that Angular is going. They will not kind of upgrade the fakeAsync or waitForAsync, can kind of work it in a zoneless environment. It's going to be either the pending tasks or we can use the native testing framework. That's very certain, I would say. The last thing is then Cypress component testing, or a testing tool. You switch a testing tool where you can use end-to-end framework to test your component as well. That is also a possibility. I don't have here a screenshot, but what Cypress is doing, it compiles the component, the testbed configuration for you. It boots up a browser, and in the browser only the component runs. But from Cypress perspective, that's an end-to-end test, which means you all have the advantages that you get from an end-to-end test. You don't need to care about asynchronous tasks. Cypress will wait for it. You also don't need to care about DOM events. So do I actually also trigger all the DOM events which are necessary? Cypress also does it. And of course also change detection also just works like in a normal application. The developer experience is of course much, much better. We still have those real timeouts, so we really have to wait if there are 10 seconds delay, it's really going to be 10 seconds, which is not good. It's not Angular. So it's a third party. It's a tool coming from the outside. We only have at the moment just Cypress component testing. Otherwise, I would just have said end-to-end testing, component testing or so. But there is just Cypress. But the problem is, you can use Cypress for component tests, but unfortunately not so much for services, or if you go a little bit lower to the unit tests, there you also are dealing with asynchronous tasks, and then you're still using Jest or Jasmine, so you need to have a solution for that as well. And then, of course, then the native frameworks will hopefully help you in the future. Good. So summary. First of all, I want to say you have seen it actually works without any issues as soon as you have asynchronous tasks. they need to be something with set timeout, that you have a real problem. And this is something we don't see so often in applications. So usually we have a promise or we mock something. It also just returns a promise, but not something which has been generated with set timeout. And then the ComponentFixture whenStable will take care for that. So it will be much easier as we might think. But you have to be careful about asynchronous tasks, really careful that you manage them correctly. It is still experimental. It's up for change, but what I said has also been kind of confirmed already a little bit. So fakeAsync, waitForAsync, I need to say goodbye. And in general, when you have a test, always try to test as close to the real world as it's possible. Jeremy Elborn from Angular said, as long as it's practical, you don't mock. Only if you're running into real issues in your tests, then you start to use mocks, fakes, or stubs, or whatever. But yeah, main takeaways, we're already at the end. We need to say farewell, waitForAsync and fakeAsync. If you write a test today, don't use it anymore. You will have to change it when you go zoneless. And really check out this ComponentFixture whenStable. It's really powerful. And as you have seen with the pending tasks and all of that, it becomes even much, much more powerful than it is today. Yeah. And that was it from my side, punctual. If there are some questions, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.